A man adopted a dog to bring joy to his son with cerebral palsy, but he could never have imagined what the dog would do afterward that would change their lives forever. "Harrison, did you hear that?" Annabelle lifted her head from the sink, her hands still wet, when a loud bark echoed from the living room. Harrison, who was stacking dishes on the shelf, froze, his heart pounding. "Yes, it's Boomer. Something must be happening," he replied, dropping what he was doing and quickly walking toward the living room, with Annabelle following him in a rush. What they found there left them speechless. Andrew, their little boy who had never been able to walk on his own, was standing. Not only that, he was taking small steps, wobbling but moving forward, while Boomer stayed close, like a loyal guardian, barking softly, almost as if encouraging him to go on. Harrison and Annabelle looked at each other, unable to hold back their tears. Annabelle's knees shook, and she had to lean on the doorframe. Harrison felt like the world stopped as he watched his son, witnessing a miracle he had never expected. Harrison couldn't help but think back to those early days after Andrew's birth. It had all started with hope, but ended in devastating news. Annabelle, his wife, had had a difficult pregnancy, filled with complications, and the birth had come prematurely. Andrew entered the world too early, bringing with him concerns neither of them could have ever imagined. The doctors were clear. Andrew had severe brain damage as a result of being born prematurely. That injury affected a large part of his motor and cognitive functions. Harrison remembered how he felt hearing those words, as if they'd ripped his soul out. Annabelle, always a strong woman, broke down. The news hit her like a wave that destroys everything in its path, leaving her drained, hopeless. For weeks, even months, she sank into a deep silence, almost as if her own guilt weighed her down more each day. "This shouldn't have happened, Harrison," she'd repeat through sobs, a lament that never seemed to end. "This is my fault." There was no way to convince her otherwise. Annabelle gradually withdrew, not only from Harrison, but also from Andrew. She refused to accept that her son was different, that the life they'd planned together could fall apart so completely. Little by little, she stopped being involved in Andrew's care, and it was Harrison who had to take everything on. The nights were long and lonely, with Annabelle locked in her room, lost in her own pain, and Harrison sitting by Andrew's crib, watching him breathe, wondering how they'd get through this. Andrew grew slowly. Every milestone a typical child might achieve in weeks or months, he reached with difficulty. At 3 years old, he still couldn't walk, and the few words he managed to say were almost unintelligible. Yet, Harrison refused to give up hope. Day by day, he took him to therapies, consulted different specialists, always searching for new ways to help his little one. He was exhausted, of course, but his love for Andrew was stronger than the fatigue. There were nights when Harrison felt he was falling apart. The hospital lights, the constant beeping of machines, the smell of antiseptic had all become part of his life. Annabelle rarely accompanied him to medical appointments. She always found an excuse to stay home, making him feel lonelier than ever. "How long can I keep this up?" he sometimes wondered as he looked at Andrew sleeping, his face calm and innocent. Despair was consuming him bit by bit, but every time Andrew looked up at him and smiled, something inside Harrison would reignite. A small spark, but enough to keep fighting. It was as if Andrew, without being able to say it, was asking him not to give up, to keep trying. And so Harrison did. During those difficult years, he became the foundation holding his family together, even though he sometimes felt as fragile as a house of cards on the verge of collapsing. One morning, on a hot day, the kind that in Guadalajara feels like it will last forever, the sun shone with a blinding intensity, and the air felt thick and heavy. Harrison got up early, as he always did, to start another day, one of many in his routine of hospitals, therapies, and care for Andrew. But that morning was different. He had decided to follow a friend's advice, an idea that had been on his mind for weeks, like a tiny light in the darkness. Adopt a dog. It wasn't an easy decision, but in the midst of his despair, the possibility of giving Andrew something new, something that could bring him joy, had given Harrison a small spark of hope. With that idea in mind, he got into the car and drove to the animal shelter. As he drove, sweat gathered on his forehead, not only from the heat, but also from the anxiety he felt. What if this doesn't work? He thought, biting his lower lip. He couldn't stop his mind from filling with doubts, but he kept going, because deep down, he knew he had to try. Andrew needed something, and even though he didn't know exactly what it was, he felt that maybe a dog could be the answer. When he arrived at the shelter, Harrison was surrounded by barking and curious eyes. There were dogs of all sizes and colors, some jumping with excitement, others just watching in silence. Harrison walked slowly through the place, stopping in front of each kennel, trying to imagine which one of these dogs could be the companion Andrew needed. Almost an hour had passed when he saw Boomer, a 5-year-old golden retriever, sitting calmly in a corner with his head slightly tilted and his eyes fixed on Harrison, almost like he'd been waiting for him. There was something about Boomer that immediately captured Harrison. He wasn't the biggest or the flashiest dog in the shelter, but he had a presence that radiated calmness, a kind of quiet wisdom that resonated with Harrison. This is the one, he thought without a doubt. He moved closer, reaching a hand through the bars, and Boomer stood up and walked over to him, sniffing curiously before giving him a gentle lick on the palm. Harrison smiled for the first time in days, feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had found the answer. The drive home was quiet. Boomer sat in the back seat, calmly looking out the window, while Harrison thought about how he'd explain his decision to Annabelle. He knew she wouldn't be thrilled. She had long stopped being involved in decisions about Andrew, and the idea of having to care for a dog would probably only make her feel more overwhelmed. But Harrison also knew that if there was even the slightest chance Boomer could bring some joy to their son's life, he had to give it a shot. When Harrison arrived home, Annabelle was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same daily routine she had adopted in recent months. She didn't look up when he walked in, but when she heard Boomer's paws on the hardwood floor, she turned suddenly, her eyes wide with surprise and, almost immediately, disapproval. "What's this, Harrison?" she asked, pointing at Boomer, who had sat down at Harrison's feet, looking at Annabelle with a calm expression. "Did you really think bringing a dog home was a good idea? We can barely handle what we already have, and now you're adding this." Harrison tried to stay calm. He had expected this reaction, but hearing it out loud still hurt. "Look, I know it's one more thing, but I've been thinking about it a lot. I really believe a dog could be good for Andrew. Boomer is gentle, and if there's anything, even something small that could help our son, I think it's worth a try." Annabelle let out a heavy sigh, dropping her gaze to the sink. "I don't understand how you can be so optimistic, Harrison. You're always hoping something, anything will change everything. But things don't work like that." There was exhaustion in her voice, a tiredness that came from long days, sleepless nights, and broken dreams. To her, every new attempt of Harrison's was just another reminder of her own dashed hopes. Harrison didn't respond. He knew Annabelle didn't mean it out of malice. It was her way of shielding herself from more disappointment. And while he wanted to argue, to make her understand, he also knew words wouldn't be enough. She needed to see it for herself. Boomer explored the house with curiosity, sniffing every corner, but it didn't take long for him to find where Andrew was. Harrison led him to his son's room, where the boy sat in his chair, his eyes distant, focused on one of his toys. Harrison moved closer and gently stroked Andrew's head, as he always did, trying to catch his attention. "Hey, champ," he said softly. "Look who I brought to meet you." Boomer approached slowly, without a sound, as if he knew he needed to be careful. At first, Andrew didn't show much reaction, but something in Boomer's movement, in his calm presence, seemed to catch his attention. His eyes fixed on the dog, who moved gracefully around the room, and when Boomer sat in front of him, wagging his tail slowly, Andrew's eyes lit up. If only for a brief moment. It was just a moment, a small flicker, but it was enough for Harrison to realize he had made the right choice. It was the first time in a long while that he'd seen Andrew react with interest to something. Boomer lifted a paw, as if offering a clumsy greeting, and that made Andrew let out a soft sound, a light laugh that escaped his lips effortlessly. Harrison felt his eyes fill with tears. There it is, he thought. This is the beginning. Because amid all the difficulties, that small laugh from his son was like a ray of sunshine breaking through into a dark room. Something so simple, yet so powerful. Every morning, just as the sun began to peek through Andrew's bedroom window, there was Boomer, faithful and patient, lying beside the bed, waiting for the little boy to wake up. It had become an almost sacred ritual. Boomer stayed still, his head resting on his front paws, watching Andrew slowly open his eyes. When the boy woke up, he was greeted by the friendly face of his companion, always gently wagging his tail, as if saying, "Good morning." As the days went by, Harrison began to notice small changes in Andrew. Before, mornings were difficult times, filled with tears and frustration because Andrew couldn't express what he wanted or needed. But now, with Boomer there, those early mornings were filled with gentle laughter and curiosity. Andrew reached out to touch Boomer's fur, letting out a joyful giggle every time the dog leaned in to lick his hand. Harrison watched those moments with a heart full of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Annabelle, although she had kept her distance at first, couldn't help but notice the changes in her son. During those first few weeks, she watched from afar, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed and a serious expression. She had spent so much time hoping for any kind of progress in Andrew that she was almost afraid to let herself feel hopeful. But seeing her son reach out his little hands to touch Boomer, watching him move with an effort he'd never shown before, stirred something inside her, something that had been buried under sadness and fear. One day, while Harrison was busy in the kitchen, he heard a soft noise, like a slow, dragging sound coming from the hallway. He stopped what he was doing and peeked out to see what it was. There, to his surprise, was Andrew on the floor, trying to crawl toward Boomer, who was waiting patiently a few feet away, ears up and eyes fixed on him, as if encouraging him to keep going. Andrew had started to move on his own, something he usually could only manage in therapy sessions, and always with help. Harrison felt an indescribable emotion watching him. He didn't want to interrupt such a special moment, so he stayed quiet, watching as Andrew struggled forward. Each time the little boy managed to get a bit closer, Boomer moved back, creating a small challenge that encouraged Andrew to keep trying. It was as if the dog knew exactly what to do to help him, like he was a therapist without needing words. When Andrew finally reached Boomer and managed to grab onto his collar, he let out a laugh of satisfaction, like he'd just achieved the greatest feat in the world. Boomer turned and licked his cheek, and Andrew responded with a laugh that echoed throughout the house. Harrison stood there, his eyes moist, grinning like a fool. "That's my boy," he thought, feeling his heart swell with pride. Annabelle began joining them in the mornings. She would sit on the couch by the window, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching Andrew and Boomer play on the living room carpet. At first, she didn't say much, but each day she stayed a little longer. She saw how Andrew laughed when Boomer made small, playful jumps around him, and how the boy lifted his hands, trying to follow his movements. It was as if those simple, natural games could do what all the therapies and medications hadn't been able to: awaken something in Andrew. One morning, just as the sun peeked through the living room windows, filling the space with a warm, soft light, Annabelle was in her usual spot, sitting on the couch by the window, her cup of coffee still steaming in her hands. She watched Andrew and Boomer as she had on so many mornings before. But today, something was different. She couldn't stop smiling as she saw Andrew moving across the carpet, following Boomer with an agility that had once seemed impossible. Boomer darted from side to side, his tail wagging enthusiastically, and Andrew, laughing, crawled after him, trying to catch him. Every time he managed to touch Boomer's fur, he let out a laugh that filled the whole house with contagious joy. Annabelle couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so much happiness watching her son. It was such a simple, pure moment, but it meant the world to her. It wasn't just that Andrew was moving better. He looked happy, something that for so long had seemed out of reach. Harrison appeared in the living room doorway, wiping his hands with a kitchen towel. He stopped for a moment to watch the scene, his gaze filled with tenderness. He had spent weeks watching Andrew progress, seeing him manage a little more each day. But he never got tired of those moments. Boomer had become more than just a companion for Andrew. He'd been a teacher, a friend, and in many ways the key to unlocking something inside the little boy that everyone had thought was lost. "Did you see that?" Harrison said, walking over to Annabelle, who was still watching their son with bright eyes. "He's moving faster than before, almost like he's running." "Yes," Annabelle replied, her voice just a whisper, as if she was afraid to break the spell. "I never thought I'd see him like this. Boomer. He's done something amazing for Andrew." Harrison smiled and nodded. "And for us too." Over time, Harrison and Annabelle's home filled with small signs of hope, signs that once seemed impossible. Boomer had become the driving force that pushed Andrew not only to move more, but to communicate as well. It was as if Boomer's constant, loving presence had given Andrew a reason to try new things. Some mornings, while Harrison was in the kitchen making breakfast, he'd hear Andrew babbling as he played with Boomer. They were just random words, sounds that didn't yet form clear sentences, but they were there. They were little attempts at communication, as if Andrew was trying to find his voice, a voice that had stayed silent for so long. Annabelle, who used to watch these moments from a distance, began to get more involved. Now she'd sit on the floor with Andrew and Boomer, playing with them, sometimes teaching Andrew new words as she stroked Boomer's fur. "What's this called, Andrew?" she'd say, holding a toy in front of him. Andrew would work hard to respond, and even if the words were clumsy and hard to understand, each attempt was a triumph. "Woof, woof," Andrew would murmur as he looked at Boomer, and the dog, as if he understood perfectly, would come over and lick his hand, making him laugh. The doctors noticed the changes immediately. During one of the therapy sessions, Harrison and Annabelle watched as Andrew moved with more confidence, responding faster to stimuli. The therapist looked at them, smiling. "I don't want to be too quick to judge, but I think you're seeing some really positive results. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. "It's Boomer," Harrison said without hesitation. "That dog has been the best therapy for Andrew." The therapist nodded, surprised but pleased. It's not uncommon to see progress with help from animals. Dogs have a way of connecting with children that we adults sometimes can't match. If he's helping Andrew, then you should definitely keep it up. Annabelle, who had been quiet during the conversation, was overwhelmed by a wave of emotions. For so long she had feared there was no way to help her son, that all their efforts would be in vain. Now, watching Andrew make progress, she realized there was still hope. A hope she hadn't dared to imagine before Boomer came into their lives. One quiet afternoon, the sun was shining softly through the living room windows, filling the house with a warm, golden light. Andrew and Boomer were on the floor as usual, playing one of their improvised games. Boomer wagged his tail, encouraging Andrew to keep moving as the little boy tried to reach one of his favorite toys. Laughter and small babbling sounds filled the air, like a melody that Annabelle and Harrison never tired of hearing. Suddenly, Boomer stopped playing and started barking, first softly and then louder, as if he were trying to get someone's attention. Harrison, who was in the kitchen, looked up when he heard Boomer's unusually loud barking. Without a second thought, he left what he was doing and rushed to the living room, his heart pounding with worry that something might be wrong. When he got to the living room, his eyes widened. There, in the middle of the room, was Andrew, his hands lifted, barely holding onto the back of the couch. But what took Harrison's breath away was that his son was standing, holding himself up on his own legs. Andrew's knees were shaking, but his feet were planted firmly on the ground. Boomer was right beside him, watching closely, as if he knew he was witnessing something special. Harrison felt a lump in his throat, and he had to bite his lip to keep from bursting into tears. "Annabelle!" he shouted, his voice filled with emotion. "Annabelle! Come quick!" Annabelle appeared in the doorway, surprised by her husband's tone, and when she saw Andrew, she covered her mouth with her hands, in disbelief. "It can't be," she murmured, moving closer slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if she looked too closely. But there was Andrew, standing, smiling at them both with a confidence they had never seen before. When Annabelle reached Harrison, they hugged, letting the tears flow freely. They had gone through so many months, so many days of uncertainty and fear, that this moment felt like a miracle. And at the heart of it all was Boomer, watching Andrew with those calm, wise eyes, as if he understood everything that was happening. Andrew looked at his parents, and even though he couldn't say anything, he gave them a smile that said more than any words could. That night, after the emotions had calmed a bit, Harrison and Annabelle sat on the couch, still processing what had happened. Andrew had fallen asleep early, worn out from all the effort, and Boomer had settled down beside him, guarding him as always. Annabelle leaned on Harrison's shoulder and let out a deep sigh. "Do you realize what this means?" she asked softly, her gaze lost in the soft glow of the lamp lighting up the room. He got up on his own, Harrison. After everything. He did it." Harrison nodded, his eyes still shining with emotion. "Yes, I know. And I can't stop thinking that Boomer had something to do with it. That dog. It's like he knew exactly what to do to help Andrew." "It's more than that," Annabelle said with a gentle smile. "Boomer didn't just help Andrew. He helped all of us. He taught us not to give up, to be patient, and to believe in little miracles." Harrison looked at her and knew she was right. There was something about Boomer's presence, something that had brought hope into their home, just when they needed it most. He remembered those first days after they brought Boomer home, when Annabelle was still doubtful, and he himself wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice. Now, all those doubts had disappeared. That night, the house was bathed in a soft, warm light as the family gathered in the living room. Harrison and Annabelle sat together on the couch, watching Andrew and Boomer playing on the carpet. It was a quiet moment, filled with a peace that had been so hard to come by in recent years. There was something special about that night, a calm that felt different, as if everyone could breathe a little deeper, knowing that things were finally getting better. Boomer, as always, was moving around Andrew, wagging his tail and jumping with little bounces that made the boy laugh. Andrew, with his contagious laughter, stood up, taking unsteady but determined steps toward his four-legged friend. Harrison and Annabelle watched him with a mix of awe and pride. They had seen Andrew struggle so much, and seeing him move forward now, little by little, felt like witnessing a miracle unfolding before their eyes. Suddenly, something changed in the air. Andrew stopped, standing still, his eyes bright and his breathing heavy. Annabelle looked at him, wondering if something was wrong, but before she could say anything, Andrew looked up and, in a soft but clear voice, said, "Mama." Annabelle felt as if the world had stopped. That word, so simple yet so powerful, echoed in her ears like the most beautiful melody she had ever heard. She had waited years to hear that word, and now it was coming from her little boy's lips. Harrison was left breathless, his eyes filling with tears. But it was Annabelle who reacted first. She knelt on the floor, arms open, and Andrew, smiling, took those few little steps that separated him from her until he fell into her arms. "Mama," Andrew repeated, giggling, as if it were the funniest game in the world. Annabelle hugged him tightly, closing her eyes as tears fell freely. "Yes, my love. Mama is here," she murmured through her sobs. "Mama will always be here." Harrison watched the scene, his heart full of emotions he could barely contain. Seeing his wife and son together, laughing and crying at the same time, was something he had dreamed of for so long. And there it was, happening, thanks to the small miracle Boomer had brought to them. Harrison came over and joined the hug, wrapping his arms around Annabelle and Andrew, as if he wanted to make sure they'd never be apart. Boomer, as always, was right beside them, ears perked and eyes focused on the family. He moved closer and gently nudged Annabelle's leg with his nose, as if wanting to be part of the moment. Annabelle laughed and petted him, wiping her tears with her other hand. "Thank you, Boomer," she whispered, looking at the dog with a smile still full of emotion. "Thank you for bringing Andrew back to us." Harrison nodded with a trembling smile. "I don't know what we would have done without him," he said, stroking Boomer's head. "This dog, he's given us a second chance. He's taught us to believe again." On the day of the celebration, Harrison and Annabelle's house was filled with a special kind of light, one that didn't just come from the sun shining in a clear sky, but from the joy that filled the air. They had decided to host a small but meaningful gathering to celebrate Andrew's progress, and above all, to thank Boomer for everything he had done for them. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, with each small step and each new word from Andrew being a reason to celebrate. And today, they wanted to share that happiness with the people who had been by their side throughout the journey. Annabelle moved around the kitchen, finishing up some snacks while keeping an eye on Andrew, who was sitting on the floor playing with Boomer. Guests had already started arriving, and every time someone entered, the house filled with greetings and laughter, bringing it to life. Annabelle, who had been so anxious about social gatherings for so long, now felt calm. She knew that this time was different, that they were celebrating something bigger than just a party. They were celebrating the hope and strength they had found as a family. "Look who's here," Harrison said, coming into the living room with a smile, joined by a couple of family friends. Andrew looked up, and although he used to get scared by loud noises or big groups, today he smiled. Carefully, he stood up, holding onto the couch, and with slow but confident steps walked toward the door to greet the guests, with Boomer staying close by, as always, making sure his little friend was okay. "Bravo, Andrew!" Some of the guests cheered, clapping as they watched the boy take those steps that had taken so much effort, but that he now took with a confidence that made everyone present feel proud. Annabelle felt her heart swell with joy, and she couldn't stop the tears of happiness that rolled down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd get to see this," she thought, wiping her tears with a smile. The party continued in a warm family atmosphere. There was soft music, homemade food, and conversations flowed easily between friends and family, sharing memories and stories. But the real star of the show was Andrew, who, with a radiant smile, walked around the yard, picking up the toys Boomer brought him and proudly showing them to everyone he met. He was a different child, more confident, happier, and everyone noticed it. At one point, Harrison and Annabelle stood on the edge of the patio, watching the scene. It was like the world had stopped, just so they could take in every detail. Andrew's laughter, the way Boomer ran after him, the warmth of their friends' smiles. Harrison took Annabelle's hand and gently squeezed it. "Look at them," he said quietly, as if he still couldn't believe what he was seeing. "It's like everything's where it's supposed to be." "Yes," Annabelle replied, resting her head on Harrison's shoulder. "I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like we're finally where we're meant to be. After everything, we finally have something to celebrate." They stayed there for a while, quietly enjoying each other's company, something they hadn't been able to do in a long time. Harrison thought of all the tough moments they'd been through, all the nights they'd wondered if they were doing the right thing, if things would ever get better. And now, seeing his son walk and laugh, surrounded by love, made him feel that every effort, every tear, had been worth it. As the afternoon wore on, the party continued with more games and surprises. One of their neighbors, who had arrived with a cake for the occasion, suggested everyone gather for a photo. "To remember this special moment," he said, smiling. Harrison took charge of arranging everyone, making sure Andrew and Boomer were in the center. "Everyone ready?" he called out, raising his hand to give the signal. Annabelle, standing next to Andrew, leaned down and whispered in his ear, "Smile, my love. Today is your day." Andrew looked at her with those bright eyes and leaned in to give her a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you, Mom," he murmured, and even though his voice was soft, everyone could feel the sincerity in his words. Boomer, as if understanding the importance of the moment, sat right beside Andrew, still and attentive, his ears perked up. The camera clicked, capturing that perfect moment when family and friends were celebrating not just Andrew's progress, but the power of hope and togetherness. Annabelle looked at Harrison as the photo appeared on the phone screen, and they exchanged a smile that needed no words. As the sun began to set and shades of orange and pink filled the sky, the party started to wind down. Guests began saying their goodbyes, but not before hugging Harrison and Annabelle and giving Boomer a pat, thanking him too. They knew Boomer had been a fundamental part of this story, the force that had driven Andrew to discover a new world. "Today was perfect," Annabelle said, as she closed the door after the last guests left. "And I can't help but think about how far we've come." "Yes," Harrison replied, looking at Boomer, who was lying on the floor, tired but content, watching Andrew play with one of his toys. All of this, it's all thanks to him. Annabelle knelt down beside Boomer and gently petted his head. "Thank you, friend," she said softly, her eyes full of gratitude. "We could never have done this without you." Boomer lifted his head and looked at her, as if he completely understood what she was saying. He wagged his tail, once, twice, and then laid back down, as if he knew his mission was complete. And so, as night fell, Harrison and Annabelle's home filled with a sense of calm and happiness they hadn't felt in a long time. They had been through difficult times, moments when it seemed like everything was lost. But that night, watching Andrew play with Boomer under the stars, they knew they'd finally reached the place they had always wanted to be. A place filled with love, hope, and, above all, miracles. Because sometimes, miracles don't come in grand gestures but in the simplest things: a word, a step, or the unconditional love of a four-legged friend. The story of Andrew, Harrison, Annabelle, and Boomer is a moving journey that shows us the transformative power of love and hope, especially as it shines through the bond between humans and animals. From the beginning, we see a family fighting against adversity. Harrison and Annabelle face the pain of having a child with challenges, carrying the weight of fear, frustration, and uncertainty about Andrew's future. The arrival of Boomer, a dog full of loyalty and love, changes everything in a way no one could have expected. Boomer is not just a simple pet. He becomes the bridge that unites a broken family. His patience, joy, and constant support give Andrew the strength to do things that once seemed impossible, like taking his first steps and saying his first words. Boomer acts as a silent therapist, a friend who is always there, ready to celebrate each of Andrew's little accomplishments, never judging, just supporting. The bond between Andrew and Boomer reflects a deep and genuine connection that goes beyond words. It's the perfect example of how animals can understand and help us in ways people sometimes cannot. Through this bond, the story highlights the importance of unconditional love and empathy. It teaches us that even though life is full of challenges, there is always hope when there's love and support, no matter where it comes from. The most important lesson from this story is that sometimes the simplest and most natural solutions have the greatest impact. A four-legged friend can change lives, and the love they give can be the miracle we need to heal. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and walk with you every step of your journey.